2024 Election Madness. The madness is in full swing, folks. Let's touch base and talk about it on the other side of this new ADZ Octave Techno 101 Lightning intro. Election Madness 2024. A special segment of the almost daily ZenCast and Good Morning Trumptopia. Holy moly guacamole. I wish I had a cool pretend made up Robin line. You know, in the style of the Batman TV show / borrowed from the original comic books. Holy guacamole and bean dip, Batman. The bad guys sure are getting saucy. That was really bad. I grew up with that, and I think technically I could claim to be a bit of a Batman fan with a Joker. I don't want to call it, I don't know what to call it, a Joker appreciation, a level of appreciation for the Joker and its many permutations, but that's neither here nor there. Holy cow, Batman! And Robin and Joker, now they're stuck in my head as if they're sitting in the room with me, like the episode is going to be about us talking about politics together. That would be so cool. I don't have the money for that kind of like production value to create or to like have me in the various costumes. That would be dope. And I wasn't intending or planning on doing any like voice work today, so it's not like I'm not going to do a Batman voice or a Joker voice. I don't have anything prepared, but now I have the idea, and I can't do it anyways. I'll probably get sued. I don't know how those other people on the internet do all those things and don't get sued, but I digress. The Republican National Convention, honestly, I just sat through. I've been waiting to speak. Well, I've been waiting to speak on a few things. And as I've already addressed, the events of Saturday, July 13th are, they are what they are. I already said everything I had to say about them, I think. Except that they're now, as I bemoaned in that episode, go check out that episode first if you want. I'll pause this. I'll wait. Go on. You can pause this and go listen to the last episode. It says, July 13th, 2024, go down in infamy, but for all the wrong reasons. That's the title, I believe. If you haven't heard it yet, please. There's too many important pins on the corkboard that carry over to what we're going to talk about now. So I'm waiting, comically, pretending to wait, whilst also vamping for everybody here listening now to this episode that have already. Are you coming back already? Good. Okay. In theory, I've comically vamped enough that anyone who's like, yeah, I wonder, what did he say about all that? Literally has had time, or will have had time, in the folds of theoretical time, by the time I finish all this rambling, to have paused this episode, found the previous episode on Sprecher.com or wherever you're listening to this podcast on, and listened to it. If not all of it, because it did turn out to be a little longer than I originally meant it to, and for that I apologize. I thought I was going to knock out a nice 15 to 25 minute episode and be like, done. But it kept going. I'm going to try to be a little sharper about the things today. And to that end, I welcome you. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and good night to you. This is officially a top tier, top level episode of the almost daily ZenCast. So, although it's also a spin-off sub-level episode of 2024 Election Madness, I hadn't really prepared and/or up until now previously done any lead-up promotion to that. So we'll go ahead and play the Almost Daily ZenCast intro here to sort of make it officially a crossover episode.
This is the Almost Daily ZenCast. Hello, and namaste. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. I am your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Let's get started.
Excuse me. Talk about some awkward timing. And thought I had it there, but not quite. And I thought I had tea. And I'm having one of those shocking, I'm in the wrong universe. I'm looking over there, and there's no cup full of hot, soothing, throat comfort tea. There's just the coffee, which only helps to the extent that it actually adds to the problem. If you know, you know, and if you don't, that is technically a little sidebar personal pin on the corkboard. I'm constantly struggling against my own bad habits and the totally not engaged with technical professional practices I know I could be, like best practices, for not only preserving and protecting my voice, but presenting the best possible vocal performance, whether it's a breaking news episode or a cannabis time 420 episode or whatnot. Welcome, friends. This podcast, for those of you who do not know, I welcome everybody, whether you're new or you're a returning listener. Thank you for being here, and whether you're listening on some other platform, which this stream is legitimately distributed to, hopefully, knock on wood, there aren't a bunch of fakes floating around, or copies that are monetized in a way that I'm not receiving the monetization, because I this person here speaking on this tape now, I'm the one true authentic author of this podcast, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo, otherwise known as RJR. And I've noticed that the internet has got a problem. But put a pin on the corkboard. I've already talked about that over on TikTok. We are in the midst of, most assuredly, the most bizarre and topsy-turvy and yet almost blatantly, explicitly, like brilliant, like aha, like reveal level, like revelatory election. I don't want to use the labels being thrown around. Yes, it's a consequential election. Sure. I am also a commentator that is neither in one or the other of the two political parties typically at the center of this tug-of-war political system. Let that be remembered, because I think it's easily forgotten. I generally, to put it simply, and to cut people short who might otherwise want to go off and accuse me of being such and such, I am indeed in coalition alliance against Trump as a political individual politician, and candidate, and against what he and his cohort of close circle collaborators, which are kind of really nepotistic if you think about it. It's a lot of really, really, really close family and money friends. Isn't that exactly what they all claim to be angry about on the other side? Pins on the corkboard. I think that this election and what we're encountering right now, it is because it has become so distended, so drawn out, so historically, like everything else going on in the world, like curiously intense and early and unseasonably like protracted and prolonged, like the heat and the hurricanes. And I think even you could argue the earthquakes, but that's a whole nother level of like, wait, could that somehow be connected? This political cycle, this political season of turmoil and chaotic, like both parties are sort of tearing themselves apart and going through their own versions of internal, quiet, civil disagreement, to put it gently. We've already gone through several waves of hubbub of a Republican Party, ideological civil war. And if nothing else, what this week's worth of speeches, especially if we include the sort of world-altering events of Saturday, July 13th, as among them, what they have proven is at least within the bubble of their own demographic, within the bubble of their own primary process, the Trumptopian movement and its newest members feel, and its poster boy feel mighty confident and smug. And it's rubbing off this, and I mean, that's an interesting place for the emotional temperature to be at. And I'm not trying to make like wild accusations here. I'm sharing my honest assessment after just observing and I'm not quoting anybody or borrowing anyone's talking points from the like commentary from any of the echo chambers, because if those of you who listen to my podcast long enough or diversely have listened to a diverse enough number of my pre-existing episodes, and I have a pretty wide-ranging catalog, which, pin on the corkboard, should be mapped out and explained before you go dropping into any random episode without understanding what you're getting yourself into, because it might be very confusing. But I digress. It's also laid out in a sort of self-explanatory way. There are plenty of signposts. You're welcome to give yourself the self-guided tour, but please do try reading the signs along the way and the introductions whenever possible and available. There are some, for which I apologize, maybe lacking text or contextualization in terms of an intro or a blurb beyond just a promo for the link page, and for that I apologize. The whole collection needs a bit of like mid-yearly cycle, like preening and pruning and curating, and maybe even a thorough re-listening to. But to everyone, I welcome you, and I humbly invite you to consider the following. A, I reiterate, for those who have forgotten or don't know or have not gathered enough evidence from my podcast, I am genuinely not angry or hateful against anyone on either side. I am separate from both parties. And whilst in recent years, and in particularly the podcast Good Morning Trumptopia, most of my criticism is specifically about the Trumptopian movement, those operators leading that movement, including the poster boy, which we might curiously note, if it has not yet, for history's sake, the ticket is now officially DJ and JD, right? Am I crazy? It's JD Vance, right? DJ and JD. And right off the top of my head, because I, like many others, had only barely heard of him a couple of times and may have forgotten, that he is the guy, the author, the creator behind Hillbilly Elegy, etc., which I have not seen. And out of just pure, never have had the opportunity to put it up and never felt the cinematic allure. It hasn't hooked me. Its log line did not and reel me in. And that's not a criticism of the movie by any way, shape, or form, but rather just perhaps an honest understanding of where my preferences are with movies. And if anyone knows what movie I am looking forward to most next and what movie I watched most recently, you might quickly come to understand. But those are all pins on the corkboard, especially since I mean this next fortnight to enthusiastically reanimate the sort of left behind special segment of the Almost Daily ZenCast known as the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo's totally irrelevant media reviews, which one could argue my Election Madness series is sort of like that, but for the special events in the election cycle, which we will get back to in just a bit. So welcome. Thank you for being here. I have to reiterate, I am neither a Republican nor a Democrat. And public records will confirm this. I cannot be accused of being of any ideological party membership. And there are many, many, many reasons, complex and yet also easily summarized. And for reasons I have A, previously explained, and B, will probably explain once more, I'm not going to go into it now. So it is an existing pin on the corkboard. But yes, my criticism is heavy-handedly, primarily about Trump. Not because I blindly despise him for any reason, and neither because of the mainstream media told me to. I have been critical of Trump since the moment he announced he would be part of the public office, when he was being given an almost sort of fair shake in the earliest moments. I'm like, no, you guys, this guy's like a total untrustworthy weirdo shyster that has already proven himself to not be a Jesus-loving, family values conservative. He is not that which he's about to tell you he is. Since day one, since the day he rode down his gold-plated escalator, and I don't know if it's actually plated with real gold, but the mythos is that it is, sometimes when it conveniently sounds cool to claim it to be. I watched that with, not because I hated him, but because I remember all of the factual-based, issues that are problematic and in any other universe would have been truly, genuinely disqualifying of anyone trying to get the nomination. And the question remains, from that day to this, after having just watched some of his most adamant and vocal critics, J.D. Vance among them, his VP, which is conveniently not being mentioned. Talk about Men in Black memory wiping yourself. An entire convention that represents state and national level party platform is wink, wink, nudge, nudge. J.D. Vance never once spoke a word of criticism against dear old Donnie. At all. Whatsoever. In fact, he has bent the knee and demonstrated his willingness to do what he's told. I mean, that last line of his was wild. And here's, if I may, get to the meat of my personal, here are where my real, raw, radically unscripted, genuine, authentic, personal reactions and thoughts are about what Mr. Vance and everyone else who was put on stage, right? If we zoom back, if I may, I kind of feel like I should put on a bit of music. Yeah, it's been 20 minutes. They all had to bend the knee and prostrate themselves. Is it prostrate? Prostrate? They had to genuflect verbally each and every single one of them. If they weren't already in the family or deeply on board from day one and never varied and never questioned and have already previously jumped through the hoops of the loyalty tests, which pins on the corkboard friends. This is supposed to be America, where the loyalty is to one another, not one individual political brand or family or person or even ideology. And the creme de la creme stroke of genius of this RNC and the parade of penitent previous provocateurs and anti-Trumptopian public speakers that are now defenestrated and put on display in the most specific way to sing his praises while he sits in against what has been historic tradition. The nominees traditionally, historically, in American politics, on both sides of the aisle, traditionally, do not show up until the night that they come to give their nomination acceptance speech. Okay? But it is a new era in the mind of Donald Trump. And he has sat in a box of the king, in a Caesar of Rome like special position, which has forced the world to stare at a two-shot of whoever is speaking and his face as he giggles to himself and or sort of falls asleep potentially and or otherwise, mutters to people around him, whatever. I would love for there to have been just a hot, big, open mic directly in front of him so that the world could have can know what he has been saying to those who have been deemed fortunate and worthy enough to sit in the box with him. But, talk about a revisionist, a really brilliantly subtle revisionist mechanic, right? Now, all of this comes after not just his curiously well-timed, and I do not know. Pause here, friends. Let me be very, very clear. I have made no claims of knowing anything. I am describing what I see others report and or make claims about. Okay? As to the authenticity of the events of Saturday, September 13th, my concern is that they will be debated. Their authenticity and their lack thereof will be debated, argued, and fought about, and probably used in ways that will resemble the call of remember the Alamo for the rest of our lives, right? As will the events of 1/6. These are like, I don't even need to speak any further. I just need to say the dates so people know what I'm talking about. And it will, as with, say the moon landing or any other wedge issue, echo chambery, disagreed upon set of conspiracy did or did not happen type, debates like flat Earth versus globe Earth. The argument will exponentially grow in momentum and in popularity on both sides to the point of making the reality at the heart of the matter seem almost irrelevant. That is my position and bemoanment. That is like, oh my God, that I don't know what happened, yo, but it will not matter. It seems to not already matter. Whatever happened, however we got here, we are now here in a place where blatant hypocrisy is cheered and celebrated. Like blatant, two-faced, I literally once criticized this guy, and now I will pretend, erase, that I never once thought he was unsuited for the office. And completely sell out. Every person that has spoken on the stage for the RNC can be seen from the lens of the perspective of those of us who cannot accept any of the arguments of the validity for wanting Donald Trump to be in office, let alone thinking he deserves to be back in office. I mean, and here's the great irony. In their own speech making, they spun around chasing their own tails. In ways that they will refuse to acknowledge, including the let's never acknowledge that we made the claim that he was secretly actually already in power and in control of everything during the course of this, and or that quite radically and to the opposite extreme, it's really Barack Obama. Never mind. The tone and the course and the way in which they convincingly mix facts, actual facts. There are some things, and I will always granted this from the days of Ronald Reagan, listening to him speak, said there's plenty to want you no matter what side of the political ideological fence you may or may not be on, and let us always remember, 40% of eligible voters in America do not vote and are not, and that's always been true. And we just always sort of forget. Even if we talk about it and acknowledge it, we just move forward as if it wouldn't dramatically change everything if 100% of them picked a side. And if there was ever an election, I started my podcast, although I wish I had this footage right here with me. I started my experiment towards this podcast before I landed on Sprecher.com. I think I was making a YouTube video. I was making a video on my phone that I spliced together using, I think, the default editing thing on my phone and put it on YouTube. And using my food, like the plate of food I was eating that I thought I would make a cool Instagram photo of first. And the idea just hit me. if 100% of everyone, including the 44 to 45 to 47% of eligible American voters that do not vote, all just voted against the one person that everyone in that bandwidth of Americans agreed they do not like, and or for someone, no matter who everyone else was voting for, if the 45% of American voters, eligible voters who never voted, all voted for, let's make some candidate up, someone real that they could just write into office that would be within the bounds of the ability that it could, and it would just be amazing that they picked them. Who would I want it to be? Me. But obviously, who wouldn't be tempted by that thought, if not downright inherently willing to say yes to that? Who wouldn't? And let's find that person and stick them in the job, right? No, because they might very well know precisely why they don't want the job, because they would do horrible, horrible things. I wouldn't. I would do crazy things that a lot of people would not understand, but that I think, if let to run their full course, would be pretty good for the country. If I could get 40% of the country to vote for an unexpected, out of the blue, write-in ticket, that's who the real silent majority is. And I've always argued that it isn't whoever the Trumptopian imagination imagines it to be, which is themselves. The silent majority in this country is the 40+%, which I think about that. Think about if we just round it to 45, because it fluctuates, and I don't have an exact number. Part of me wants to type it up right now, but let's just, for better or worse, for argument's sake, let's round it down and say that it's 42%. That there's wiggle room that it could reach 45% of them and these are eligible voters. I'm not talking about some fear-mongered based imaginary number of people that come out of thin air that are never been allowed to vote. Because, pin on the corkboard, it has been a fact, no matter how many times a Republican talking head has said otherwise, that people who are not legally eligible voters, they've never been allowed to vote, and no Democrat has ever said what we want is to make them vote. Never. That's a made-up GOP talking point that is explicitly, and I can attest to it from the ground up, a just fabricated thing. I've never, and I'm not a Democrat. I'm not blindly defending them. Now, one could construe something that the Democratic Party does indeed support, which is a path towards citizenship. But once granting citizenship, then they would have the right to vote. But there are people who blindly and fearfully believe that the Democratic Party is successfully, and this is pure nonsense, it is not true, successfully bringing in people to vote that are illegal aliens. And that we need to put in a law to prevent that. There is, and has always been, laws in one shape or form or another that make it illegal for non-citizens to vote. The only people who are eligible voters are those who qualify under the matrix, and for everyone else, anyone else, to vote has always been a crime. Now, have some people tried to do it? Sure. Have some people been caught trying to bend and or break the voting rules? Yes. And in recent memory, over the course of the last several elections, since Trump rode down the elevator, that escalator, and started spewing nonsense, baseless accusations about everything and anything, who has been caught the most often? Womp, womp, womp. Republican voters. Probing the obvious places where they think they might be able to get away with individual cases, not giant boatloads of or organized criminal level, to magic. No, but the single most often case of, I think we found some evidence of fraud. It turns out to be a republic, just like, and this is the tragedy of it all, they are engineering a socio-economic, philosophical environment, political environment, cultural environment that they are in denial of themselves building, in denial of themselves architecting, to be self-destructive, to be self-toxic. So, like, the sublime irony of the RNC and the chorus of calls for unity in the wake of the admittedly tragic and unacceptable event that happened on Saturday, July 13th, the rest of this escalation of speeches, and I'm quite curious to see, because apparently Trump has made some statements that insinuate that he's radically changed heart in some form or fashion. But it doesn't really feel like it. It feels like they've decided to wave that banner violently about instead of actually editing or changing or altering anybody's actual speeches. I should wrap things up, but I do want to point out, and I didn't see anyone talking about this one as I turned off the cable TV after having flipped through all of the major channels as I caught looking for the speech making itself and not trying to avoid most of the babbling talking heads on either side of the political ideological echo chamber. Okay? The most interesting thing about J.D. Vance's speech, beyond the simple factual reality that he very eloquently, and he is, I will give him this much, and I'll give Team Trump this much credit for choosing him. He is a powerhouse, everyman vibing, but also intellectual elite accessible, and like he can talk both out of both sides of that two-faced, because he is a two-faced, flip-flopping, change o' heart, politically evolving, I will totally vote for the guy I said I would never vote for kind of hypocrite, right? But he is I will give him this much credit, masterful public speaker, in that he can clearly speak he can speak whatever crazy, complicated, nuanced, coded speak of the new order that is responsible for this Agenda 47 that they've rebranded it to, that was whatever Heritage Foundation's changed. Heritage Foundation has been around for a very long time, folks. And some of us have caught a lot of flack and a lot of laughing mockery for pointing out that they are the deep state on the other side, which the other side is patently wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We realize the hypocrisy, but we're never going to even talk about it, as they, every accusation from the other side is an acknowledgement. As they accuse the left of having a deep state, they cultivate and prepare everyone to bend the knee to the people put in power by their very own right-wing, ultra pseudo-religious, pseudo-ethno-nationalist deep state of their own. Okay? And it's mind-blowing to see. And to watch everyone just clap along. As he does that, not only that, but he quite elegantly and subtly uses his grandmother and the sort of mythology of like this next level of mythology building of Trump as a quote warrior or fighter, despite the reality of his bone spurs. And it's interesting to point out that while JD may have actually served in the military, he served in the media relations department, which if it were a Democrat, they would be ripping him to shreds for, instead of saying thank you for your service. Because that's the PSYOP department, isn't it? That's the deep state department, isn't it? And it was really fascinating that he somehow managed to, in the same speech, as he bends the knee to a person he literally, abjectly, morally refused to endorse for the first half of his immensely brief political life. Pins on the corkboard. We can do a multi-part special series of episodes about his career path, which everyone applauded, but he didn't really illuminate. And none of the people on the news media outlets that support Mr. Trump did either. The only ones taking a crack at him in that department, which it is quite interesting if you dig into the steps he took out of the elites, one of the elite universities that the far right generally usually will not tolerate a person being from or associated with, which is, I guess, perfectly okay and fine for him to be about here because he's got hillbilly in his background, I guess. But the combination of his Mima's story, the first one, not the second one. He's got two Mima moments in that speech. Go back and watch the speech again. Tell me I'm wrong. But the one about where she said something about JD, next time I see you hanging out with that bad person, I'm going to do something really violent, which will be A-okay for me to get away with doing. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Say no more, because sometimes that's what it takes. With his supposed service in the military, which I think I could be wrong, but I'm going to wonder if he saw any real action in the unit that he was in. Maybe he did. I don't know. I will give him this much credit where credit is due. It's not easy to get into the Marines, period, and then serve in whatever unit. So if he was lucky enough to get, and I mean it in a respectful way, because I don't disrespect the military, you guys. It's not that I'm anti-military. I'm anti the weird level of corruption that gets into everything people that are human do everywhere. Okay? So pin on the corkboard. Don't accuse me of being something that I'm categorically not. But it is weird how the platforms, especially my criticism of the right is because on every political party, there's some evidence that some of their members are going to make hypocrites of themselves and be exposed for some kind of corruption. That's not a feature of the party or the parties. That's a fact of the reality that it's flawed the way humans are flawed. All politics is, all as a system, right? No matter which system it is. So it's absurd and hilarious to me when anyone in any membership pack, in any membership tribe, takes irrational levels of pride and exemption of, exceptionality of cause. Pin on the corkboard. We've talked about that recently in a recent episode. Go find that and listen to it. And we'll come full circle and talk about it again, I'm sure. Because when you zoom out large enough, some of the problematic red flaggy issues are there at a deep structural level on both sides. As one meme recently boldly dared to point out, they'll argue about actual policy and also this added level of cultural, ideological culture war fighting in a really flash in the pan, theatrical, but somewhat believable way. But ultimately, in the end, each party sort of facilitates the remnants of the other party's core policy survive. And as I've long pointed out, despite the level and degree to which they might yank on the rope, it's like a Punch and Judy show a little bit. Even when the reaction to the reactions turn out to be tragically, stupidly, horrifically real, right? Even if, the theatrics and the pomp and circumstance and the rhetoric and the saber rattling and the demagoguery and the Christmas cards. Now, here's the thing. The reason I criticize the right wing a little more than the left wing is because the left wing, those who, like, if you know, you know. They know that as soon as we've really held the right wing to account, what's next is a holding to account of the left wing and a realization that the corruption doesn't come from one wing or the other, because they're trying to lift up or direct the flight of the same bird. One of the deepest tragedies and pieces of most golden comedy, as some of my memes have tried to point out in the past, and I'm sure I'll come up with clever new ways to state it and point it out in the future, and or just regurgitate my old memes or find new ways to repoint them out, is that when you zoom out far enough and account for the genuine differences, because they have to have them. They have to have factual differences to maintain the worldwide Federation of Wrestling level of cajolery, as I like to call it, or wink, wink, nudge, nudge, plausible deniability to their ultimate, we'll let that one go and thrive and slide and get forgotten and normalized into the discourse. Because it's two wings of the same bird yanking on the same chain, yo. And while it is not inaccurate to draw a line between the two, as they have indeed taken the pendulum experiment to new heights, pin on the corkboard, the pendulum is still pinned where it's pinned. And no matter how far you push it in one direction, it will swing back and forth and reorient itself with equal amount of force until it reaches a place of equilibrium where some people feel it needs another push. Maybe I lose sense of my analogies. But here's where I zoom back far enough and I go, hey, hold on a second. Wait a minute, you guys. Yes, if they're accounting for the actual factual differences, because there's no denying. There's no denying what the actual differences are. We must also not turn a blind eye to the things that they both conveniently seem to turn a blind eye to. Right? Not the least of which is that the system is integrally interconnected. And that no matter how dramatically they rattle the sabers and foam at the mouth when they talk, the leaders and the speakers, no matter how eloquently they do it, there is a point at which the hypocrisy becomes curiously, blatantly, reflective back on itself. And, for a party that claims to be a party of small government, they have been throwing pasta strands of big government vibe on the wall to see what sticks, on and off, and with increasing frequency and enthusiasm, and with increasing blatancy, blatant, that's exactly what we're doing. Kind of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, say no more about it. In a way that the other wing is sort of I don't know how much longer they will sustain their role of we're fighting against this before the whole dynamic either rebalances, because it's ultimately unsustainable unless your goal is actually to set up the very thing that you're accusing each other of supposedly the other guys are doing this. And that's the thing. The one thing the two sides have in common is that they build in their own way and from their own starting points and in their own direction what can be, especially given a certain lack of information about both sides, be a very seductive and convincing argument that only their own party is the righteous, good, and true party that is actually fighting for the little guy, and the other party is somehow, truly, weirdly, wildly, out of control, working for the worst possible forces out there, and are a literal threat to the sane, rational, and righteous democracy that only our side stands for. They both stake the claims or claim that the stakes are that high. I think there's both ways of saying it that are grammatically correct. Both political parties are staking claims that intense. And you can't deny that. And a certain percentage, which is not 50-50, and is also not 60-40, It is a curiously smaller than a third on each side of this political, ideological tug of war, wedge issue driven echo chamber of our party is righteous and true and defending the best things that are worthy of being defended, and that other party, the worst kind of the worst threat of the worst kind of the worst evil you can imagine. Now, two things can be true at once, and that's the problem. Once you start slicing things up that way, it gets either too overwhelmingly messy about, wait, which way could the things be true and what is untrue? It's so much simpler, so much stress-freer, so much less stressful to slice things in an absolutist, only the thing I agree with can be monolithically, absolutely righteous and true and the correct side. And that is unsustainable in the long term, friends. Even if one side is truly playing the bad cop side to the point of being like, that's scary, dangerous, what they're playing with, and they are. Sorry, that was my coffee cup. My coffee thermos, which I suddenly remembered still had some coffee in it. The catch-22 is that the opposition is always seduced to be as, and this cuts all four ways that you can imagine it cutting. No matter which party you're in, your party is being challenged, seduced, and sort of fear-cajoled into stooping lower than whatever the lowest low you're being fear-mongered about that the other side is stooping to. Both sides do that to themselves and each other. And I dare you to change my mind. No matter how you slice it, no matter, and I see people slicing it up every which way. Now, is there a way to slice it so that we can be like, but this is the sort of most broadest normal, and I hate using that word because most people who love normal wouldn't judge me as such. But is there a way to be like, this is the more normal of the two? Yes, in a binary system, there's always a way to be like, I have to choose this. If you can only choose, which is where we get the lesser of two evils rationalization to begin with. I'm not arguing that. I literally am not, although people love to, in a sort of, let's project on him so we don't have to even think about whatever he's actually suggesting kind of way, which is what everybody on all sides does. No matter which party, primary, two-party system, or tertiary, or secondary, third-party system, however you want to slice it, everyone eventually goes, if we can't comprehend it or don't want to agree with it, or it makes me need to realize that I need to question my own tribe's self-righteous argument. And I don't mean self-righteous in any other way other than every tribe says, we are the true and victorious good ones. And everybody else who disagrees with us must be a bad guy. No matter how you word it, it's ultimately always there. I can't jive with that, folks. And although, if I had to, and we used to say this all the time, and I don't know that it's a good thing to keep saying, but if someone was pointing a gun to my head, and I had to decide, and it wasn't like Russian roulette, it was full-barreled, like, it's this or we pop you open and unalive you, which would you pick? I guess I would have my choices, but not having that pressure, I can make my truest choice, especially if that one was limited to not include my preference. That's the worst case scenario. But I don't like that, right? Like, I am adamantly opposed to political or ideological or religious or cultural or just straight up because you're angry and don't have any other tools available to you, violence. I am a pacifist. Like some radical people out there in history are alleged to being, even if we sometimes choose to forget or ignore. And that's the thing. One of the deeper, crazier, more like the world's not ready for this conversation thoughts I had multiple times whilst watching this, and which I'm sure I will also have whilst watching the other party's convention. But whilst watching this week's political party convention, the RNC, was this. And it's funny how they just won't talk about, they won't use this branding, this sloganing, this psychological tactic, this marketing tool anymore, ever again. Despite still invoking that divine thing. But I couldn't help asking myself, especially when they were alluding to some sort of godly protection of Trump. I'm like, what would Jesus, if Jesus were the actual living Yeshua Christos, whoever that was, God, and boy, would I love it for Yeshua Christos turned out to have originally been the woman in a pairing, in a wife-bonded pairing that led a tribal, like, maybe not so heteronormative, maybe not so rich white guy normative, maybe, sort of anti-establishment, most definitely not Christian nationalist, hippie, dippy. I'm trying to remember the name of the tribe that I know historically he would have been attributed to based on where he's actually born, which is curiously a city that is where? Palestine, historically speaking. But that's an issue. That's the issue no one wants to talk about, and that I will probably people get really mad at me for. But and some would say that this is heretical scholarship, but there's scholarship that indicates, and I don't have references at my disposal, but in my own journey of curiosity and questioning about the person we commonly refer to by various different names, including but not limiting to Jesus or Yeshua or Christ or Christos. To the best of my understanding, he studied with the Essenes, who were a subcategory of the therapists that were like entheogenic mystics, or in postmodern terms, hippy-dippy new age gnostics, people who were pursuing spiritual knowledge through practical spiritual entheogenic meditative dietary yoga-like magical almost even rituals, not rich landed gentry of a white Caucasian blood lineage demanding that we forcibly legislate totally unrelated pseudo ethno-nationalist ideology because they claim Jesus told them to, right? Like, if the person we point to with those names were to magically show up, this is the way after a lifetime of investigation, because I would never use the R word, but I was once a Bible-thumping member of the club. But then, as with other clubs that I was once a card-carrying member of, I started to ask questions that other members were conditioned to gatekeep without thinking, and that were cited. I asked questions that were used as the very reasoning for being banished from the club. And this happened at a relatively young age, or, a young age in my life. I was already intellectually questioning the dogma that people all too often in this world, let alone this country, sort of blindly cheer and accept and just fold into their lives without ever actually questioning. Because I believed and have believed for a very, very, very long time the intellectual need to question everything and to not be dictated into blind faith belief about anything by anyone at any time. Okay. There's so many pins on the corkboard, friends. Not the least of which is if the person that the people of the Trumptopian Party, formerly known as the Grand Old Party, the GOP, the RNC, and this is the Republican National Convention, right? The poster child, the leader of the elect, the presumed and soon-to-be confirmed nominee at the head of the party, and presumptive, ideological thought leader, let's not even go down the usual arguments, because it's funny how this is being brought up, but not as emphatically as I thought it would be. A week ago was chilling with a self-described tyrant. And exactly the kind of leader that they claim when they are most vehemently criticizing the other party's trying to be. Now, it is quite fascinating that the layers of self-accusational, recursive, circular non-logic that has evolved since Trump injected himself into American politics. I don't pretend to know anything more than what I can understand as to be verifiably true from my place here in the world, limited as it is. So anything that I may be actually factually wrong about, I will sincerely apologize for and update myself about when I don't make accusations blindly. And mind you, most of the time when people think I've called someone a name, I'm literally citing and referencing the fact that both teams are calling each other's leaders that name. And I'm not actually siding with or personally making a declaration that I believe one or the other. I'm fascinated that we're living through a chapter in history where, now, it's not a perfect one-to-one equivalency necessarily, but both political parties of the American political experiment accuse the other of being somehow inherently or subtly or secretly or explicitly, depending on the instance, against the very founding documents of the country that they each claim to be stepping up to protect and serve. But with the irony that is the slogan of most police departments, and that most police departments around this country have a few too many instances of failing to live up to that gold standard that gets swept under the rug or, quickly sort of shuffled off into the horizon of the memory sinkhole that is reliably there in a world where we just get thrown an ever-increasing, onslaught of a cornucopia of crazy things. Not the least of which is this past fortnight's worth of escalating rhetorical madness. I'm not a registered Democrat, okay? And I'm not. My criticism of what the Republican Party has become or is becoming during this sort of interestingly prolonged and seemingly now re-energized co-opting by the Trumptopian pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-cultural, pseudo-religious movement. And I use the word pseudo on purpose because they have no real platform. Donald Trump himself has no real platform. He's literally politically distancing himself from the realist platform that the GOP/RNC have collectively had in my entire adult lifetime of openly critiquing them. I mean, not since the era of Reagan and maybe the first Bush have had this coherent and truly alarming set of well-defined policy platforms that are not about actual problem-solving policy, but rhetorical implementation of dogma. There's a lot of things that one can drill down into in the text. And full disclosure, I'll be the first to admit I've not had the time to sit down and drill through all of it. And that's the scary thing. A lot of people will not. Okay? And therefore, a lot of things may be said about it that are spin or completely maddeningly untrue things. And this will likely happen on both sides of the ideological echo chamber. Because although I like one side better than the other, and I'm standing currently in coalition with one side in opposition to the other, both sides need a thorough holding to account of the problematic issues, because that will lead to the aha moment that the American political class or the American political populace, the electorate, those who are engaged in the volleyball game of public discourse and public policy argumentation and political back and forth, that which we usually mean in a non-violent, non-lethal way when we say we got to fight the good fight, right? And get into the good kind of trouble, which is to get out there and get people out there to vote. Now, the system has to there's a lot of ways to look at the system, some of which are really rather radical and are curiously coming from people who seem to be, taciturn and disaffected, disenfranchised, disillusioned members of both, either or both parties in the political party mechanics, and including the third party system, because the third parties collectively, as a chorus of many different third parties, kind of act as a third base counterweight that is a singular third party. From the eagle-eyed meta perspective that I'm encouraging everyone to zoom out to. The system grinds on, right? And if there's a few things that I think are true about the system, despite the other things that may be said about the system and or proposed and or accused with or without a basis, there are a few things that are true about the system, and one of which is something that no one wants to think about. No matter which iteration, which version, which portion, which aspect of, which dimension of, which facet of, which party of the system, all systems that have ever existed in human history are designed, created, developed, deployed, and turned from imaginary, made-up ideological constructs and dogma that must flow therein from those constructs into realities by the human species through the effort of human ideological normalization, like the normalizing of imaginary ideas until they have power. And that we can all realize that, oh, if that's what all of that is, we can maybe skip the part where we yank each other's chains so hard it gets lethal. And the consequences of the rhetoric and the repetition of the dogma is that some people are so angry at everyone else that it turns into where we find ourselves now. Because if we don't collectively, on all sides, regardless of party, take a moment to be like, we don't need this. It can be about solving the problem. If we just acknowledge that before we, like, political party is a construct that is made up, and that before it existed in nature, we were all humans. We were all flesh and blood. We are all ambulatory meat sacks of blood and bone that miraculously have this capacity to observe reality and comment on it and form opinions and form made-up imaginary things that take on power. And that if we acknowledge that, then we can more effectively solve problems instead of unalive each other over imaginary, ideological, dogmatic literature, to put it politely. Or to put it one way that can may hopefully, help to defray, or what's the word I'm looking for? De-escalate, depressurize. There's another one that has to do with the fuse. Defuse, I guess? Defuse the situation. I've been rambling way longer than I meant to. And I am so sorry. I apologize. I meant to make this a very relatively short episode. And once again, we made it super huge. And we failed to play any DJ set music, except for the very intro. So on the outro, we shall play a nice short little bit of what is my personal favorite and one of the most popular. Dear friends, I don't hate Donald Trump, never have. I get accused of that a lot. I don't hate anyone. I've also never blindly defended a politician. I've also always said, hey, here's what I can agree with, and I will agree across party lines with speaking points. I can see one of the tragedies to me as an observer is I can see when I sit in the midst of the RNC, I can see why people get pulled in. Now, my criticism is often harsh. They are getting milked and bilked. Some of them can afford it, but a lot of them can't. And they are bending over backwards for a person that they would not tolerate in the other party, theoretically speaking. They're bending over backwards to defend actions and behaviors that they would not tolerate in the other party. And they've done it so intensely. They've folded that hypocrisy so fundamentally into the center of their identity that they've required it as a way to be allowed to participate in the party. They've made most of the headline speakers of the RNC into blatant hypocrites, including the VP pick, because they at one point spoke their minds in what appeared to be honest reaction to Donald Trump. Now, I do not pretend to know what it is, but there is a center of gravity there that I would speculate is not the man himself. I don't think anyone hangs out with Donald Trump, the person, and says, I must, after having felt one way, radically change the way I feel about this person. I think they call me crazy. I think that everyone from Rubio to Vance must still feel the same way about him. Deep, deep, deep down. But somehow, at some point, at some meeting, something was offered. Or some leverage, some lever of leverage was pulled. I have no idea what it is. But everyone in the Republican voter base that has ever believed that their party was supposed to be about integrity should be like, whoa, wait a minute then. Hold on a second. Instead of being so busy applauding these people bending the knee and applauding this guy, he has sat in that king box looking as old and fragile and lumpy and not physically fit as he goes on about Biden being, and smug, so smug, maybe in a slightly delusional way, because I don't know. It's weird. It's been fascinating too, because in the other tent, the DNC has been ripping itself in half, tearing itself apart in a way that's way more bloody and real, even though they're trying their best to keep it subtle and quiet and mostly behind closed doors. But enough of the bloodletting is being caught on the fringes that it can't be. I don't think it can be denied over this question of demanding that Biden step down in the face of him saying, "No, I was elected. The people nominated me, and I don't want to, violate the voice and the electoral power of the American people. Let's just run the game as planned." And it really has been fascinating. They can, could, should, would have been capitalizing. And that, mind you, I say all this as a critique of the DNC because they are putting themselves in the weakest position effing possible. And it feels almost on purpose. Like, what are you guys doing? Then again, every step, I've been asking that question. Some of the reason why, dear listeners, if you ever wondered why I'm not on live It's because this. I'm staring at the microphone or this device, my iPad 6th Gen, and going, the only thing I think I'll say, the episode will be like 1 minute of me going, the F are you people doing? What are we doing? What is the species doing? And not having a real good answer other than apparently stringing ourselves up by every means possible to fail collectively and to bypass every opportunity to not only make things better, but transcend all the reasons why we tend to beat our head against our collective heads against the brick wall of making it worse against our own best interest over and over and over again, decade after decade, generation after generation. But that's a really big conversation that I've already rambled along enough for this particular episode. I don't think that there is an absence of hope. The hope is shining right there brilliantly and almost intangibly, like beautifully, like immutably, impossibly, indestructibly there to be perceived. But I can't, like, if I were to be pointing at the menu, you'd be eating the menu, right? Instead of the food. And I'm not saying that to belittle anyone. I'm saying that's the enigma as described in one analogy, in one attributed analogy to the Buddha, of the human nature. Like, why do we do this? I have my days. Like, why do we do this? Because I don't know. Call me crazy. You can disagree with me. I have been, I'm sure, in many individual instances, discredited in individual people's minds as blasphemy. This is blasphemer for daring to say something like the following. But if I could openly invite the authentic, real, genuine voice and body and embodiment and full spiritual, tangible manifestation of the whatever that personhood was, and I use personhood in the broadest possible imagining of the definition of the term, that we point to in truth, whether people use it correctly or not is another question, with terms like Yeshua Christos, whoever that really, really was, before the dogma, before the mythology, before the telephone wire gone mad oral tradition, there was someone there who may not have even been called by those terms, but that is the inspiration for all of it. If they came back right here, and if they were the kind of individual that I think they must have been, I wouldn't be surprised if they were a woman, because it wouldn't shock me at all if the roles and the genders got erased and reversed and erased. B, if they were a woman, they were a witchy, entheogenic, yoga-y, hippy-dippy, new age, crystals and stones and ayahuasca and mushrooms and weed and tribal, like, ancient wisdom spiritual practices that unlock the human phenomena so that it can transcend socio-political, economic, ideological, cultural identities and move on with its evolutionary growth towards that which is represented by the genuine, authentic biological phenomena that must have been observed and then named many names, like Buddhahood, like Christhood, like insert here all the other cultural variants to include them all that fit, that make sense, right? when we speak about a person who achieved, a human person who achieved or attained, it's everywhere, right? There's a mythology of that. Now, in Christianity, in many of its variants, especially in post Roman Catholic Empire Latinification of, and the like, one of the things that a lot of postmodern, and not to go off on a whole sidebar, we've talked about it before on the podcast, and if this interests you, please, I humbly invite you to come on down to the Almost Daily ZenCast, available for you for free, with just a little bit of advertising so that I can maybe earn some income from this mental effort, this cultural public discourse effort. I mean, if all the crazy, fear-mongering people that we are glad no longer can, if they could do it over there on the right, why can't I do it over here on the transcendentalists' 0 point sector of the spectrum of public discourse? Anyways, there's so many sidebars we've opened up, and I need to spiral out of control and end this episode because it's gone on for way too long. Maybe I'm wrong, okay? I'm not trying to make any accusations at anybody, but if, as I often have to say, if the shoe fits and you feel a little zinged by the things I've got to say, don't get mad at me, but ask yourself why. Ask yourself why self-proclaimed Christians are bending over backwards to bend the knee and kiss the stinky scooty patootie of, and the ring of, in a very sort of, they're mimicking the behavior of Catholic ethno-religious tyranny. They just don't realize it, right? They've just, and I cannot believe I have lived to say these words, friends, but they have temporarily, I hope, knock on wood, may the efforts to recorrect and right the ship be successful in my lifetime, in this election cycle. Before this election cycle, for crying out loud, he technically has the invulnerable presumed immunity to do so anyways now. Why isn't he doing so? To fix what has just been mind-bogglingly adjusted. But I cannot believe I've lived to say these words. But the extreme right has successfully achieved despite all the other frightening, horrible, and violent things going on in the world, which they could get their fair share of blame for, as they blame everybody else but themselves, they've successfully achieved the violence-free revolution of redefining the presidency as temporary kingship until someone goes, whoa, we got to rewrite that back into and rectify and put some words in to make sure that we plug this collection of holes in the dam. Because literally what the founding fathers said was that we came here and we're trying to establish a government so that is a separation of church and state, theology and kingship. Because let us remember, when they said church and state, the state wasn't 50 little mini countries and their 50 little mini governments operating as sort of friendly yet contentious non-nation states that are all part of one nation. The separation of church and nation at the time when they said it was the kingdoms from which they'd left to establish a new nation state. And the king that claimed to have not only the glory and the power of believing in the Lord Almighty, but the authority bestowed upon him exclusively. I don't think that a certain percentage of Trump supporters realize, especially those that laugh at the religious implications because maybe they themselves are not of the same particular variety of religiously obsessed, political idolatry. And I don't know, that Trump himself does not seem to be an actual Christian to me. He seems to be a political opportunist, willing to be turned into a pseudo-political demagogue and a pseudo-religious and nationalist pretend king. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It's not really absolute immunity. And as they praised and adulated him for the sacrifice he's made, and the comedy of it is that with every beat, we need. I want to almost do this myself, but I'm afraid to. Is that we need the comedy beat of the retort that fits at every turn, every claim that they make. It's like because if half of it wasn't. If half of it wasn't an accusation that it was really being an admission, the other half was a wish fulfillment of like, here's what we actually aspire to, which was just as crazy. And there was definitely a subtle and very cleverly sublimated permission structure for saying, political violence, isn't it bad when it happens, and won't it be fun to blame them when more of it occurs? Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it's bad. And there's no room for it here either. Unity, unity, unity. It's right there in his words. I'm not accusing him of anything. I'm just thinking it's really fascinating that he chose to tell the stories that he told in the order that he told them. I'm speaking now, for those who lost track, of Mr. Vance in today's closing speech. I don't know if there were other speakers after him, but I was sort of, multitasking and paying attention to what some of the speakers today, but also really thinking about yesterday's speakers, because that was all previous primary competitors that had some pretty bold things to say, that sometimes that I was actually kind of surprised they went as far to actually say. And curiously, Mr. Vance is there. Once literally a never Trumper. What power, what is the center of gravity there? I do not pretend to know. Will I be shocked and amazed and surprised if there turns out to be some interesting, semi-clandestine, semi-embarrassing, very controversial center of gravity there that gets exposed? And is that what, have we, or here's another silly question that's totally irrelevant but also meaningful at the same time. Have we already had this election cycle's October surprise? Or are we, as I think I've speculated in some earlier election on some media somewhere, overdue for what will maybe too many October surprises? Too many weird things in a row. And is this just the beginning? This bizarre contradiction, because it is a weird two picture frame. Let's zoom out. Let's not remember, both parties are in the midst of this business of conducting an election. One party, which has spent the last cycle, the entire life cycle since the very last time everyone in America lined up to vote. Mind you, I never did make or record or present my election reform ideas, and I think I should probably reanimate myself to do so, because I really, if in case no one's heard me say it, despite not being either a Republican or a Democrat or a registered third-party member anywhere, I love this country. And I am not against a genuine democratic election process. There's some crazy shenanigans and malarkey going on, and it's because the human species is susceptible to that for human species reasons. And that if we want to, my core message for anyone who doesn't know isn't that the Democrats should win. Although I would rather they do win than the Republicans. My core message is, in the face of this kind of one-upmanship and like double-edged sword at each other's necks cosplay of saber rattling that is apparently inspiring and fomenting real world out there acts of tragic and unacceptable politically motivated violence of various types and flavors. For let us not sweep under the rug that someone else was in a confrontation with police as an aggressor that made an attack just outside of the security zone of the RNC. Since it launched, so since Saturday, there's been, some other thing, which they've not talked about. There's so much to unpack. There will be so many future episodes about which to unpack it. The election madness is crazy, and whilst there are indeed many issues of reform, true, deep reform must be addressed and discussed. The nonsensical way, and those are two different words, and I'm using them each separately. The nonsense being peddled in such a nonsensical way, there's the better formed sentence I meant to say just now, of the right is so egregious. It's so over the top. It's so they are the ones literally trying to light the fires whilst denouncing all forms of, what is that called? Pyromancy? No, that's magic with fire. Pyro something. Pyromaniacy, just being obsessed with fire. If they can't, and then clutching their pearls, and often, resorting especially when it backfires on them, or even preemptively when they see the potential for it backfiring on them, talking about how they can't handle the heat, like being they out snowflake the people they call snowflakes. Okay, and I hate, sorry, not sorry. But as an entire tribe, they brainwash their own sheeple and out sheeple the people they vocally call sheeple. Okay? They are all marching to the tune of a guy who is literally just the litany is there and has been recited so many times. I am exhausted by it. Because they just LOL and shut down and reject that as all of it being untrue about him. Because they're too busy praising their imaginary cartoon version of the divine thing we commonly use the word God to refer to, or used to before we got sidetracked by the cartoon versions, for protecting him, whilst telling everyone else to get over it whenever it's their beloved person or their favored politician or their own family member in a mortal situation or a gun violence situation or a terror situation or just a situation in which someone has unjustly, unfairly died, ranging the full spectrum from the unhoused to the people of Gaza. Okay? this political tribe identity is entirely reliant on mocking and ridiculing others whilst simultaneously demanding that no one dare mock and ridicule them. Because, and it's suddenly it's become adopted as a cultural plank of the platform, because Trump is that way psychologically and behaviorally as a person. I'm not an expert, but I have eyes and ears and understand that different people behave differently, and you have to pay attention to the patterns. And I observed the patterns with him long before, during his many decades of being a bad Democrat, that he's a bad member of any political party because he is inclined towards behaving like a mob boss. Not because, I'm saying that not because anyone told me to say that about him, but because he does it. And the unfortunate, scary, undeniable, fact-based truths about him outweigh all of the fancy, fluey, flu, sucky, kissy, smoochy, powdery, suck-uppy thing, brown-nosery things that any of the people who have, and I'm embarrassed for them, they are humiliating themselves, like prostrating themselves. I almost said something else, but that doesn't start with the C. That's the wrong level of it. But they are definitely making a show. They have, this whole week has been making a show of the party formerly known as the Republican Party giving itself entirely over to this insincere, like making a show of demanding hypocrisy of itself as it hands itself over to this insincere hypocrite of a man, right? And that they've succeeded in redefining the presidential. It was dangerously well protected enough to begin with, folks. My critique of the presidential office here in the United States, as much as I love this country, my question, isn't that a way dangerously close to being a temporary king, stems from long before Donald Trump engineered, with the aid of the Heritage Foundation and several others that could all be lumped together as what they all call the deep state and accuse the left of doing. Now, does the left do the same thing? I've yet to see any convincing evidence that they do it to the extent that the right is doing it. Not in any way that is as clear and as evidentiary as we're seeing the Koch brothers, the Heritage Foundation, the other one. I always get their names conflated and confused, and then therefore hard to remember. There's the Heritage Foundation, and then there's also, and they are old school, and then there's of course new ones whose names I have probably heard but don't remember. And there's, all the little sidebar ones, like the Build the Wall super PAC that obviously never built a wall. Where did that money go? And there's the millions of dollars he's been pulling in since Saturday and will be in the days and weeks and months in the aftermath of this. He's going to continue to milk and bilk his base. And that will be true regardless of whether or not he wins or loses, whether he successfully wins without having to create a kerfuffle, or he loses and creates a kerfuffle and loses that kerfuffle, or loses, creates a kerfuffle, and God forbid, succeeds. But they've been kind of winning enough lately. I was very justified in calling out their attitude, given the lack of wins for so long. But I think that until this year, even though I was quite painfully aware and critical of these appointed activist, that's a word I was struggling to remember in a recent recording elsewhere, these activist justices, which is something they claim to be against and despise and accuse the left of being in favor of and using exclusively to socially engineer all of Western society. They're now literally using and doing that which they supposedly oppose. And my warning to the left is, don't become the right as you stand up to the right, because the right is already the right as it stands up to the imaginary projected thing that it accuses the left of being. And the reason, and I'm not defending the left against any actual corruptions, dear Mr. What's-Her-Name, who has been rightfully convicted, I do understand. I can't remember his name right now. I can see his face in my mind, and I cannot remember his name. And that's just a problem. It's not that I don't know his name. It's not that I don't know who he is. And it's not that I have not consistently been opposed to him the moment the evidence came out. He has been proven in a court of law, of corruption and of deception and of attempting to abuse a system of government to enrich himself. He should step down, and it is good and correct, in my humble opinion, even though I'm not a Democrat. It is good and correct that this is the moment we're in right now. Whilst the Republican Party is lifting up and bending over backwards to defend and clear the name of, through questionable malarkey and shenanigans moves in a very big government kind of way, which is like, wait a minute, I thought you guys were opposed to big government. A guy who clearly does not deserve to be the head of their movement based on the principles they claim to espouse, which they have since I began observing them in the early days of Reagan being already president. And when I arrived here, in the midst of the Reagan era, like, they've been hypocrites since then, politically as a party. Maybe not everyone individually as a human being, but politically as a party, it has been a party of blatant hypocrisy. Of, we will accuse you of being a horrible person and try to cover up all evidence of our being horrible people. We will claim to be fighting for the little guy and actually be cutting taxes for the ultra rich because they're paying us to. And at every twist and turn, it has been in my observed, in my period of observation, it has been the right that goes out of its way to make itself the hypocritical bad apple political party. In a direct left versus right versus left analysis, right? But when, for example, how many Trump policies are still left over, active, on the books, and despite lots of promises and statements about clearing them out right away, doesn't look like they're going to be. Why is DeJoy still running the post office, which I fear is something a lot of people forgot about and lost their fervor to be, and we really should be concerned about that, given all the hubbub about mail-in voting coming from the right, which Donald Trump is most hypocritical of. He will literally, has always used it, will probably use it again, whilst claiming that it is horrible and evil and wrong to be using it. Inspiring people to pull shenanigans out there in the world, whilst ensuring, quite weirdly, and this is I talked about this over the course of all of these elections. If he talks his own base into underperforming Trump has consistently, in every election he's been a nominee for the Republican Party in, he has in one point or another, in one way, shape, or form or another, created a permission structure for rhetoric to obviously escalate to potentially violent levels and for his own voter bloc to underperform. And then complained about all of it being rigged and made demonstrably false claims about the other side, quote unquote, stealing it. And now he's repeating that. I'll give it to them. It's complicated, nuanced, and sophisticated, even when they first did it in a ham-fisted, awkward, unsophisticated way. They've had nothing but time to get better at it. And I don't know that the party on the left, the blue party, the blue team, is any more authentically about actually stopping it than they accuse the red team of being about other things. Because ultimately, what I see is a bunch of human beings getting encouraged, talked into participating in a system that requires them to divide themselves up in truly weird ways over made-up ideology and flawed, corrupt human political puppets. And to run on this treadmill of constantly running away from solving the problems by running after the people we're going to accuse as being the culprits on the other side, instead of solving the problems. It's the only thing that both parties seem to agree on is that there are problems, and most of the time, it's the other party's fault. Consistently. Decade after decade. That's the treadmill that the active American voting electorate runs on. And those treadmills are positioned in an echo chamber. And then there's everybody else, and they don't participate. And I'm not presuming that they have a coherent ideological infrastructure of their own. They probably don't. I only happen to be a member of that demographic by happenstance of not being allowed to vote in this country for a bunch of different complicated reasons. The simplest of which being that I am an alien from another dimension and am treated like a piece of infrastructure. I might as well be a toaster when it comes to all of that. But I do have free speech, dear friends. And I will tell you this. The real problem is not which party is the most righteous and true. Both parties make their good points. Both parties lean heavily on an overlapping yet diversified set of facts and semi-facts. And both parties then spin the rest of it their way. And both parties make a very convincing, impassioned, believable argument that their parties are the ones trying to do it the right way to defend us from the other party. Jesus, and both parties have some level of degree of playing the Jesus affiliation card, right? Obviously, the red team a little harder and a little more blatantly hypocritically than the left, the blue team. But I swear to you, if Jesus were here, he would be like calling both of them out on a really simple question. Instead of These two enormous, giant, complicated, prolonged, expensive, ideologically manipulative, and apparently about implementing and deploying ideological conditioning more than anything else, political rituals that cost so much money. Why aren't either and or both of you, dear diverse collection of human beings that have an overwhelming, although not entirely unifyingly accurate, like it's not universally true of everyone there, some amount of like claim to being Christian or another, why aren't you taking all that money and spending it on feeding and healing and clothing and housing the hungry, the poor, the sick, the unfortunate, the homeless, the outcast? Why do you prefer to spend your public discourse energy, time, and political ritual and political capital and political branding on claiming to be a Christian nation, claiming to be a family values party, claiming to be followers of Jesus, whilst literally taking food out of people's mouths? And don't tell me that's not true, as the Republican Party is the party that has stripped away lunch programs while simultaneously trying to force the Ten Commandments and the Bible into classrooms in a nation that was founded by founding fathers that respected everyone's diverse right to practice what a religion they wanted, whilst also having the freedom from all of the religions controlling the branches of government. Any and all. That's what they were working towards. It's subtle, but it's there, friends. They are trying to be as open-tent and as conciliatory as possible, maybe because of the incident, maybe because of some grander scheme or strategic thinking, but they are in a way that's egregiously hypocritical in the framework of they call themselves the party of Christ. The Democrats don't, whilst they also recognize that there are many flavors of Christianity and that they are all welcome in the tent, that there are also, many other religions welcome in the tent. All I'm saying is, if the actual spiritual, entheogenic, yoga practicing, table flipping, whip snapping pacifist showed up right here, full-blown Merkaba, chariot of light, descending from or emanating from whatever spiritual dimensionality he's chilling in right now, and materialized before me in physical open, what's the word? Open wound, for the words, there's the wounds, it's a Latin thing. To prove, oh, look at me, I'm really the Christ. Here is the wounds that are magically, perpetually open and unhealed and yet perfectly healed. I would ask him that what do you think about what they're doing over there? In your name. in your name, in blatant contradiction to what few teachings of yours they've allowed to survive over the course of many, many centuries of them being brutally altered, edited, diminished, swept away, altered. And he and or she, and or maybe a couple, right? Maybe they were a power couple that were like a tantric yoga couple that did it together, but we erased the female part of that couple away over time. Their first thing would be like, what are you people doing in our names? If Jesus showed up right now, I would be humbly so full of gratitude if he showed up on my show to do it. He'd be like, what are you doing? If he showed up on CNN, if he showed up on whatever the most powerful platform, he would probably be capable of doing something pretty impressive. He mysteriously is not, but that's a pin on the corkboard, whole other discussion, whole other conversation. But if he did, let's take that if for serious, a hot moment. The real one too, not the made up Rambo Jesus strapped to the teeth and ready to unalive everyone first and let the Father sort it out, as some have turned into a mantra and a t-shirt and a leather jacket. But the real one, the living, real McCoy, the actual Trinity embodied in a metaphysical mystery that is the crucified Christ, returned from the dead, and returned from whatever holographic fractal divine light status he transmuted into. Based on everything I know, and everything I've ever read, and everything I've ever questioned and thought about, and balanced through and worked on, and my years formerly as a Bible thumper, and then as someone who rejected and came back and revisited and re-questioned and reanalyzed from the lens of that rejection after the fact, I am convinced, and I challenge anyone to change my mind, and I highly doubt that they'll be able to, that they would be here steadfastly asking, what the bloody F are you doing in my name? And how do you think you're going to get away with continue doing it now that I'm here and can prove you all wrong? Let's go with the flipping of tables and the whipping of some safety whips, because I'm sure he wouldn't do it to hurt anybody. But he would get a little blue in the face going, nope, y'all doing it wrong. You better stop doing whatever that is and start feeding some hungry people. Stop pretending to be anti-big government whilst deploying some really big government oppression tactics like what you've just done in the past 10 months, and start housing the homeless instead of criminalizing the unfortunate tragedy of finding oneself unhoused. It is a tragedy to me that he doesn't show up. But if he could, I realize that is an intense way of putting it. Because he doesn't, and believers, those who would have already or will now have decided that I'm a blasphemer, they'll tell you that he'll never will because I'm unworthy. Now, I have my own reasons for understanding why the authentic Yeshua doesn't show up. But I don't think anybody, especially not those who are so wrapped up in the Trumptopian ideology that they're willing to just blindly spew the weakest of prefabricated talking points instead of engage in real public discourse, are ready for any of that discussion. Neither are most Christians who are uncomfortable with the levels to which Trump is being elevated. Now, they were subtle about it at this convention, right? I didn't see any golden statues being proudly presented anywhere. I didn't watch every single minute of the convention, but I did try to watch big chunks of it in real time and with as little of the left's commentary as possible and as little of the right commentary as possible. I just wanted to hear what the speakers had to say. Now, I was also very curious to hear what isn't said and what some of, because there's more than just a left-right dichotomy going on. But I digress. It's interesting. We could do a whole special episode of the different ways that this particular event was covered, but I don't have the energy, nor the staffing, nor the funding to do so. That kind of stuff takes teams and teamwork. And until I get enough listeners here and on all the other platforms so that that kind of thing can bootstrap itself into existence, I'm not there yet. And I can't do it. So I digress. The fraudulent level, as subtle as it remains right now, in what we're seeing, to which the association of Trump, a man who clearly does not know the Bible and does not spend very much time in churches, and is willing to bullshit about it, and a already wayward and increasingly false doctrine and nationalist ideological movement that calls itself the whatever American Christian nation thing is. There's several, including groups like The Family, hashtag if you don't know who they are, watch out, that are operating in our political infrastructure and pushing the pendulum to new heights in this one particular direction, not because they believe any of the criticism, critique, or accusations, fair or unfair, biased or unbiased, that they sling on at the opposition or anyone who disagrees with them, but because they are believers in something that even they don't openly talk about that much. And that should have even people who have every right to otherwise retain and continue being members of a Christian denomination that should be worried about. Because it takes and reinterprets the most generic and benign interpretations of postmodern Christianity to new levels that are truly absurd, ridiculous, especially if the end point is, and God chose Trump to do it, that which they believe it is their calling to get done. And of course, multiple pins on the cork board there, friends. We've talked about this before, and we'll have to come full circle and talk about it again on the podcast. And we've talked too long on this particular episode again. I'm not trying to be alarmist, and I'm not trying to accuse anyone that isn't doing anything of something they are not doing. But let's be really real. There are a group of people out there that believe in something that's a little more extra and a little bit weirder and a little bit more dangerous than your general, generic, everyday, non-nationalist version of any of the religions out there, okay? As soon as you add the word nationalists and start trying to normalize that, you're talking about taking things to the extreme or beyond which we just spent time supposedly fighting a just asterisk, was it? Very long and multi-phase and multi-failure riddled war about, in opposition to another religion's extreme what's the conjugation? Extremist, minority contingency that was making a lot of noise, or supposedly was. Or a bit of both, right? Exaggerations about and actual aspiration too. You can't, and that's the irony, because they have and always will bandy the term religious freedom about, whilst turning it as inside out and topsy-turvy as they blame the Democrats of turning America. Inside out and topsy-turvy is one of their favorite things to say the Democrats have done to America, but they've literally turned everything about the separation of church and state inside out and topsy-turvy, and are trying to ram down the throats of not only the Democrats and whatever faith denomination coalition they may or may not belong in or belong to, because they are a coalition of many different faiths and people without faith, but also down the throats of the 45%, 44%, 42%. Let's be super generous and round it down all the way to 40%, which is still huge plurality, which when you think about that, you've divided the remainder into 3 groups, not 2. This is the silent majority, even if it is at 10% less than 50. At 40%, whoever the American eligible electorate that refuses to vote and has never voted, which I technically don't count myself in because I'm a few degrees away from being eligible to vote. I am categorically uneligible to vote. And could point to all the reasons why. And they're not that bad. They're definitely not the worst reasons why I may have, in theory, it's not that. Whatever you think, whatever dark, worst case scenario you may jump to, when you hear that, it probably isn't that. Because mine's the simplest one. It's also one that triggers people, but that's a whole other issue. There's a 40% of eligible voters that don't vote and haven't voted in a really long time. And I've always said, it's their calling. If they want to hold the right-wing, left-wing, us versus them system of nonsense accountable, they need to storm the ballot box in the most peaceful, vote for one person, and it does not have to be either of the primary party nominees. If there's the argument against third parties and why they shouldn't be allowed to, quote, weaken the vote is only true if you consistently rely on not acknowledging and not encouraging, and just rely on the 40% that doesn't vote, that not showing up and not voting. Right? Whether you acknowledge it or not, you have to be dependent on that. As soon as that is no longer true, as soon as the majority of that 40%, and I know it's a pipe dream of mine, but my whole thing has always been if only that 40% picked one person or one ticket. And I was toying with the idea of why not 2 stand-up comedians? And back in the day when I first was pitching this, I was Colbert and Stewart. They're interestingly, weirdly different, and yet perfectly American enough to maybe get away with it. If the 40% that doesn't vote set aside whatever their differences might be and picked one ticket, even if it was, now, God forbid, I don't know, the self-righteous presumption in Trumptopian logic is that 40% would swing pro-Trump 100%. The absence of a red wave at every midterm and the fact that he loses the popular vote, let's review it again. Let's have another set of hearings. Let's recalculate. He lost the popular vote. That makes me disinclined to believe that the true silent majority, which is that 40 to 42 to 45 to 48 to 50% of eligible American voters that just don't vote. I don't think they want to vote for Trump. I think they also really don't want to vote for Biden. But if they all set aside whatever their differences probably really are, because they probably aren't, as I constantly like to remind everyone, caught up in thinking that every group or tribe or demographic has to be a monolith of monolithic unity. No one is. Unity is something we got to choose in spite of, in a transcendent setting aside of our differences. That's what unity means. That's the only way you achieve unity. The callous, crazy, nonsensical thing about the Trumptopian new right wing is that they're totally co-opting all the right language, all the left language of unity and transcendence and setting aside our differences, but they mean only within the tiny, tiny box that is the tolerance zone of what we want to do, which is the stuff in this plan, which we won't really talk about in depth because we already wrote the plan down. And that is dangerous. And if the to the best of my understanding, the Democrats don't have an equally scary plan. They play a really good part of fighting the good fight against what the Republicans are doing on the other side, which is playing the part of being the really good party, playing the part of the religiously tyrannical. But we are in a weird infinity symbol of we've come full circle too many times, you guys. And it's too self-evident. It's too self-evident for anyone who pulls out far enough that the two wings are indeed joined at the hip or the shoulder or whatever you would call it, the neck. Two wings, one bird. So the tug of war ultimately fails. Except that it's a tug of war of performative value, except for when it gets way too real. And either way, the true majority of Americans want something else that transcends either of the extreme set of ideological, dogmatic talking points and fighting points presented by either side. Because that's what gets me. That's why I speak out. Because there is a loud plurality. It's like we're tired of both sides and of both parties and of all shenanigans. And it's in that direction that has to be a bit centrist first that we must move, because later it becomes transcendent and we heal ourselves enough ideologically, politically, religiously, culturally, individually, collectively, mechanically, energetically, at the soul level, at the heart level, at the body level, at the tissue level, at the mental level, we will manifest the healing so profound if we step off the treadmills of endless ideation and argumentation. That's where I'm at. That's why I'm not like flat earthers think I'm a globist and globists think I'm a flat earther. Stick with me. This analogy really works. That's because both of them are stuck on a treadmill where they're running to chase a set of carrots that are really sticks. Both models are flawed. The globe earthers will be shocked and amazed because whenever I step into the flat earth versus globe earth, they mostly see me critique and or debunk the flat earthers. Globe earth is way more accurate. The way the Democrats, generally speaking, are way less hypocritical and way more plausible. Like if democracy were free of all the possible hypocrisies and red flags and problems and corruptions and shenanigans and malarkey, then what the Democrats aspire to would be ideal. But they also fail to achieve it, right? The way the Republicans fail to achieve what they aspire to. And it's somewhere in the middle that everyone gets along. And all of it, though, the tug of war is about saying it's the other side's the idea of what they want that is so scary wrong that it must be considered quote unquote evil. And I'm a person who's like, wait a minute. And I get why that works. Because but wait a minute. Right? Like all the evil in the world is what we make of it. What we choose to do that is evil. I'm not saying that there isn't evil. It just doesn't need to be imaginary evil. It doesn't need to be made up evil. It doesn't need to be supernatural cartoon character comic book level evil. It doesn't need to be unprovable evil. It doesn't need to be unfounded evil. It just needs to be the evil that it actually is. Let's leave it at that level. I don't know. I feel like I've run out of spirals to spiral out of control in. But I thank you for listening. And I urge you to watch both. If you already know who you're going to vote for, watch both. And yes, I stand in solidarity with everyone who is trying to make sure that Trump does not gain re-election. Vote not Trump. Which means that, I also agree with the voices in the Democratic Party saying right now is not the right time for the Democratic Party to tear itself in half over its candidate, because we could have it's so crazy how it's flip-flopped. The Republican Party was about to really could have ripped itself apart. Like people were beginning to leave. And now some people are coming back. And it's kind of impressive and bizarre and shocking and mysterious. And the Democratic Party, although I don't blind-faithedly believe, everything that they peddle, I would rather see them win and then hold them to account their claims that they would turn around and make up for the harm, the tangible, measurable, messed up harm so far caused by everything achieved by Donald Trump and the Trumptopian movement that has swept him into this unprecedented position of appearing to have had single-handedly dominate an entire political party apparatus. And I have my doubts as to whether or not he truly was able to do that all on his own. Like, what does Donald Trump, whose prior multi-decade history of operating as a person who enjoyed the fraudulent tendencies of the side of American culture that loves mob bosses, right? The side, and this is where I come back full circle to like that's the crazy thing about Trump. He talks about getting away with breaking the law and breaking norms the way mob bosses talk about getting away with breaking the law, which is the way J.D. Vance's Graham talked about breaking the law. Not just the political law in that instance, my dear friends, but the law of the Christian God is handed down in the Ten Commandments. Because wink, wink, nudge, nudge, we are special enough to get away with that and to do that, which is truly alarming. So the confluence of those things should really be alarming, not only to the voter base on the Republican Party side, as well as the Democratic Party side, but the eligible voter base, and for dramatic purposes, reverse the order in which I just said those, but also the eligible eligible to vote, but historically non-voting base. This confluence of crazy on both sides, and the fact that the third party person is who? Like the leader, the highest profile third party candidate that isn't really a candidate is RFK, who just, I could do a whole 3-part series on like what is going on based just on what is publicly confirmed knowledge, information about him, right? Publicly verifiable information about him. Like why is he the guy pulling the Ross Perot card now in this moment in history? And surprise, surprise, not surprised, sorry, not sorry, this recently leaked video that seems to suggest that anyone who's suspected of him being in league with Trump may have been on the right track, because some of us were like, oh yeah, he's definitely here to pull from whichever side, in as much as that any third party pull that is strong will benefit Trump. Even if it pulls from Trump's numbers, it'll ultimately pull more dangerously so from Biden's. This whole thing, the crazy has only just gotten started, and we are months and months and months away from the actual thing resolving itself in its post-electoral denouement of many weird procedural things, not the least of which being a second January 6th. And I don't say that meaning to imply that the Trumptopians will do it again, but will I be in any way, shape, or form surprised if they do? Successfully or unsuccessfully? No, not at all. So, buckle in, folks. There's going to be a lot to talk about. Not the least of which is the simple true reality that this is the least effective way for a society that struggles at an identity level to live up to, if not officially, if not at least proximally, to Christ's teachings. Because there's not a lot of hungry people getting fed out of this, despite uncalculated billions of dollars being spent by everyone. And I'm the critique, if the shoe doesn't fit, if you are not a self-proclaimed follower of Christ, fine. Then that part of the overall criticism doesn't technically apply to you. But if Jesus were here, he'd be looking over the rim of his trifocal glasses going, the F are all of you who do cosplay at being believers in what I taught. What are you doing in my name? And all of that whilst really intensely failing to successfully feed everyone that's hungry, house everyone that is without a roof above their head, heal everyone that's sick for free without charging them, and welcome the foreigners in as if they were your own brethren. And to do so because that is what we're here to do as people, not as members of any particular political party or tribe, but because that is what we're here to do as children of the divine thing. Sorry, not sorry. But that's the biggest pin on the corkboard, right? This only applies, this shoe only fits to those who would wear it. But as a person who has been drummed out of the world of Christian belief for asking this, I've come full circle to the point where now I'm no longer asking, how dare you, anybody, especially a politician, claim to be a follower of Christ? How dare you, especially politicians organizing a movement that are literally trying to immorally shove fake pseudo-Christian dogma and doctrine into legislation down anyone and everyone else's throats in a way that implicitly and explicitly violates Christ's teachings. How dare you claim that this is a Christian nation and then try to run it in the ways you seem to be wanting to operate it, as exemplified by your beloved leader's previous term in office and the proposal, as I understand it, for the next one. How dare you talk about Christian nationalism and live in such stark, brutal, oppositional hypocrisy and denial of the most important of the teachings that remain of Yeshua Christos' teachings. The Christ did not teach what is coming out of these people's mouths, no matter how much they also jam in praising words and empty hallelujahs. Don't take my word for it. Go read the original Aramaic. And that's what I got to say about that, friends. Thank you for listening. The election madness will continue, and despite every other day feeling like I should just give up and stop, I will continue to bring to you my honest, genuine, authentic, critical thinking based, real, raw, radically unscripted thoughts and diverse opinions, because I don't have one monolith of opinion. I have many opinions, some of which, decontextualized and recontextualized the wrong way, may seem almost hypocritical. I may sound like an atheist one day and then be talking about the power of forgiveness and prayer the other. Right? So I join you to join me in a deep dive by participating in the discussion and hearing me out. There is a beautiful back catalog of many an episode that you are humbly invited to sample and listen to in any order and in any sort of chronology you prefer. And there are many separate sub-series, so be sure you know what you're looking for and what you're looking at. And of course, many future episodes where we will continue to ask these questions and discuss them further and bring about some clarity, hopefully, and try to help bring others to the understanding that we can continue to beat ourselves senseless with this same absurd nonsense, or we can actually abdicate the madness, transcend the ideology, and collaboratively solve the problems that we face in a healthy way for everyone. Because Jesus didn't start a religion and did not want that religion to become this that we're seeing on television and on the streets and in the pulpits. And I've been called names for daring to say that, but join me in exploring all the reasons why I've come to that conclusion and why I think that if I could have Jesus here physically, tangibly, in a way that would compel people listening and or watching to go, oh, smack, that probably really is the actual Jesus. But I think he would say the things I have suggested that he might say, as opposed to anything else. That's one of the core themes of this podcast, especially if you sort of follow along with the pins on the corkboard and realize that some of the segments of the podcast go in a very different direction because they're about the fiction, which is interconnected, but also starts from a very different angle. All right, I'm going to stop rambling. I'm going to stop. I can't believe how long I've gone on for. Friends, it is indeed a time to unify. And it is indeed a time to transcend. And we got to do this by, well, that's the question, isn't it? How do we do that? Tune in for my thoughts about that and much more. In past episodes, because I have addressed it, it is one of many a pin on the corkboard. And in future episodes, because I'm sure the way my brain works, we will come full circle and discuss it in depth some more. But ultimately, I think it is by taking a deep enough breath of like, that we can all just sort of look at each other and go, wait a minute. This is all just made up ideology. All of it. Big D, big R, little r. And we can reform it and change it in a way that is not toxic and not corrupt if we first acknowledge that that corruption is not exclusive to some targeted group or another, but is a feature of some underestimated, underexplored, underaddressed function of the human species. And we got to go there. We got to heal the trauma that causes the corruption that leads to the systems always becoming what they become in order for us to build systems that become anything different. But before we can do that, we have to transcend the very ideological constructs that we've created that separate us from being able to see truths together. Because the people whose blind faith have accepted indoctrination in any of these different dogmas, they're having a really hard time seeing anything from any other perspective. And that's a difficult thing to do without those individuals feeling attacked. And actually attacking one another never solves that problem. On that note, friends, I beg you to go out there and be good human beings to each other out there in the political public discourse, in the voting booth, in the video game lobbies, in the social media platforms, in the DMs, and everywhere else that it counts. Because if there's nothing else, that is at the center of the way in which we answer the true calling to fix the crazy by remembering to be good human beings to each other out there in the real world as well as everywhere else. Peace out, friends. Till next time, I've been your humble host and public discourse rambling philosopher, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo.
And that is what I've got to say about that. As always, thank you kindly for listening. This has been the Almost Daily ZenCast with your humble host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. Until next time, may peace, love, and grooviness blossom in your heart.